March 1945. Tokyo, after midnight. The air is heavy with smoke that does not lift by morning. Entire districts lie flattened, not by invasion, but by production lines thousands of miles away. Rail yards are twisted metal. Factories that once worked around the clock now sit silent, starved of electricity, steel, and fuel. Along the coast, empty docks stretch into dark water where ships no longer arrive. Across the Pacific, lights burn through the night. American shipyards launch vessels faster than enemy submarines can sink them. Aircraft roll off assembly lines already assigned to squadrons not yet formed. Losses are recorded, replaced, and absorbed without pause. Inside Japan's war ministries, reports stack higher than the rubble outside. They speak in numbers, tons, barrels, units produced per month. The language of courage has given way to arithmetic. And by 1945, the math is no longer arguable. By the summer of 1944, the global war had entered a phase defined less by maneuver and more by exhaustion. In Europe, Allied armies were advancing across France, supported by a logistical network that stretched unbroken from North America to the front lines. In the Pacific, the United States had pushed steadily westward, island by island, compressing Japan's defensive perimeter and exposing the limits of its reach. Japan had entered the war with a clear strategic assumption. It could not outproduce the United States in a prolonged conflict. Its planners understood this before the first carrier aircraft lifted off from Japanese decks in December 1941. Instead, Japan sought a short war, one in which early victories would cripple American will, secure vital resources, and force a negotiated settlement. Speed, shock, and decisive battle would compensate for industrial inferiority. For a time, the plan appeared viable. Japanese forces overran Southeast Asia, seizing oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and key raw materials across the region. In 1942, Japan controlled a vast maritime empire. Its navy, built around elite carrier air groups, seemed capable of contesting the Pacific. Its army, hardened by years of war in China, expanded rapidly. But beneath these gains lay structural fragility. Japan's industrial base was concentrated, energy-dependent, and vulnerable to disruption. Steel production lagged far behind that of the United States. Oil reserves were limited, even after territorial expansion. And refining capacity remained a bottleneck. Shipbuilding relied on skilled labor that could not be easily replaced. Aircraft production emphasized quality over volume, producing sophisticated designs in numbers that could not absorb heavy losses. Across the Pacific, the United States was transforming itself into an industrial state of war. After Pearl Harbor, civilian factories were converted with unprecedented speed. Automobile plants shifted to aircraft engines. Steel mills ran continuously. New shipyards appeared along both coasts, assembling standardized hulls that required less time and fewer specialized workers. The emphasis was not on perfection, but on throughput. By 1943, American production had reached a scale unseen in military history. The United States was launching aircraft carriers in months, not years. Liberty and Victory ships crossed the oceans in convoys that seemed inexhaustible. Aircraft production exceeded Japanese output by multiples, not margins. Losses that would cripple other nations became statistical events. Japan attempted to respond. Emergency production programs were initiated. Designs were simplified. Training hours were reduced to push pilots to the front faster. But every adjustment traded long-term effectiveness for immediate survival. Skilled workers were drafted. Transportation networks strained under constant use. Industrial dispersal efforts began. But materials and time were already running short. The strategic balance shifted decisively. In 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed much of Japan's remaining carrier air power. Leyte Gulf followed, costing the Imperial Navy irreplaceable ships and crews. With these losses came something more damaging than defeat, the realization that replacement was no longer possible. Still, Japan fought on. The doctrine of decisive battle remained embedded in planning. Leaders believed that if the United States could be bled heavily enough in a final confrontation, political pressure might yet alter the outcome. But the assumptions behind that belief were eroding day by day as American production continued uninterrupted. And as the war moved closer to the Japanese home islands, the question was no longer whether Japan could win a decisive battle, but whether it could sustain war at all. By late 1944, the strain on Japan's industrial system had become impossible to conceal. The maritime empire that once promised security had instead created distance. Distance between raw materials and factories, between factories and front lines. Every mile added vulnerability. American submarines exploited it relentlessly. The United States Navy's submarine campaign cut into Japan's merchant fleet with precision and persistence. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies were sunk faster than they could be built. Coal shipments from Hokkaido fell behind schedule. Food imports declined. By early 1945, Japan had lost the majority of its pre-war merchant tonnage, and with it the ability to move resources inside its own empire. Oil became the central constraint. Aircraft sat grounded not because they were damaged, but because fuel was unavailable for training or combat. Naval units remained in port, unable to maneuver without consuming reserves that could not be replaced. Even when oil reached Japan, refining capacity limited its usefulness. High-octane aviation fuel was scarce. Substitutes were tested with limited success. At the same time, the American strategic bombing campaign intensified. B-29 superfortresses, operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, began systematic attacks on Japan's industrial centers. Early high-altitude precision raids yielded limited results, but by March 1945, tactics shifted. Low-altitude incendiary bombing exploited the vulnerability of Japanese urban construction. Entire manufacturing districts burned, not as a byproduct, but as the objective. The impact extended beyond physical destruction. Electrical grids failed, transportation collapsed, small workshops that fed larger factories disappeared overnight. Industrial dispersal, moving production into rural areas and tunnels, came too late to restore output. Even intact machinery stood idle without power, components, or workers. Inside Japan's leadership circles, the data became unavoidable. Reports compiled by the Ministry of Munitions showed aircraft production declining despite emergency measures. Shipbuilding schedules stretched beyond relevance. Ammunition output failed to meet output. Basic operational requirements. Loss rates exceeded replacement rates across every category. Yet public acknowledgement remained impossible. The war effort demanded unity, and the concept of surrender remained politically and culturally unacceptable. Instead, planning shifted quietly. Defensive strategies emphasized conservation. Units were instructed to fight without expectation of resupply. New weapons were developed that required minimal industrial input, simple aircraft, improvised explosives, human-guided systems. This was not innovation driven by advantage, but by constraint. By early 1945, Japan's leaders no longer debated whether the United States could be outproduced. That question had been answered. The debate now centered on timing and cost. How long could resistance be maintained? How much damage could be inflicted before collapse? And whether the scale of American industry could be leveraged against itself through sheer casualties. The war had entered its final logic. Not one of maneuver or surprise, but of endurance measured in factories destroyed, ships sunk, and resources denied. And as this reality closed in, its effects were felt differently depending on where one stood. On the front lines, in planning rooms, on factory floors, and inside the minds of those tasked with impossible decisions. On isolated islands across the Pacific, Japanese soldiers began to understand the war's direction, not through strategy, but through absence. Ammunition arrived late, if at all. Medical supplies dwindled to improvised bandages and boiled water. Rations were reduced repeatedly, then replaced by foraging and starvation. Radios fell silent. Mail stopped coming. Units that once trained with precision now conserved every bullet. Live fire exercises vanished. Replacement troops arrived poorly trained, sometimes without rifles, sometimes without uniforms that matched the climate. Officers adapted by lowering expectations. Survival replaced maneuver, holding. Ground replaced counterattack. In the air, pilots faced a different kind of shortage. Fuel limitations meant fewer training hours. New aviators were rushed through abbreviated programs, entering combat with minimal flight time. Aircraft losses could not be replaced. Every takeoff carried the knowledge that there would be no second machine, no spare parts, no relief crew. At sea, the reality was harsher still. Ship crews sailed knowing that damage meant abandonment, not repair. Ports lacked materials. Dry docks stood idle. Survivors of sunk vessels were rarely reassigned. There were no ships to crew. Morale did not collapse all at once. Discipline held. Orders were followed. But beneath it, a shift occurred. Soldiers began to understand that bravery could not summon food, fuel, or ammunition. Courage no longer translated into capability. The enemy, meanwhile, did not slow. As industrial shortages deepened, Japanese battlefield tactics adjusted accordingly. Commanders planned not around victory, but around attrition. The goal became delay, forcing the United States to expend time, materiel, and lives in exchange for territory stripped of strategic value. Defensive positions were constructed to minimize resource use. Artillery was limited. Ammunition stockpiles were rationed for decisive moments that rarely came. Infantry units were ordered to fight without expectation of reinforcement or extraction. Withdrawal was often forbidden, not for ideological reasons, but because transport no longer existed. Naval planning followed the same pattern. Fleet actions were undertaken with full awareness that losses could not be replaced. Ships sailed with partial fuel loads, crews trained knowing that damage control supplies were finite. The Navy's remaining strength was committed not because it promised success, but because inaction promised nothing. Even offensive operations reflected industrial scarcity. Attacks emphasized shock over sustainment. Short bursts of intensity replaced prolonged engagements. Specialized units were formed that required minimal production investment, trading longevity for immediacy. Every tactical decision was shaped by what could no longer be supplied. The battlefield had become a reflection of factories thousands of miles away, factories that did not exist in sufficient number. And while Japanese commanders adapted under constraint, their opponents operated under abundance. By 1945, the contrast in industrial capacity between Japan and the United States had become a visible feature of the war itself. American forces fought with the expectation of replacement. Aircraft were flown hard, knowing losses would be absorbed. Tanks were abandoned if damaged beyond quick repair. Ships rotated through maintenance cycles supported by floating dry docks and overseas bases stocked with spare parts. The United States did not rely on a single technological advantage. It relied on systems. Standardized components allowed rapid assembly and repair. Training pipelines produced crews faster than combat could consume them. Logistics chains delivered fuel, ammunition, and food across oceans with predictable regularity. The B-29 Superfortress exemplified this approach. It was not just a bomber, but a product of an industrial ecosystem. Factories capable of producing complex airframes, engines in volume, and the fuel to keep them flying. Losses were replaced. Squadrons were reinforced. Operational tempo increased rather than declined. Japan's technological response moved in the opposite direction. Designs were simplified. Materials were substituted. Production shifted to smaller workshops with limited output. Aircraft were built without radios, armor, or self-sealing fuel tanks. Weapons emphasized immediacy over survivability. Logistics followed the same pattern. Fuel allocations were calculated in hours, not weeks. Ammunition stocks were fixed at levels that could not be replenished. Once expended, they were gone. Technology had become less about innovation and more about compromise. Within Japan's senior leadership, the industrial reality of the war pressed heavily on decision-making. The Imperial General Headquarters received monthly production reports that told a consistent story: decline. Each new offensive plan had to be measured against shrinking capacity to sustain it. Commanders understood that American losses, even when severe, did not alter operational momentum. Destroyed ships reappeared. Airfields lost to attack were rebuilt. Units withdrawn for rest returned at full strength. The enemy's endurance was structural. This understanding created tension. Military leaders sought opportunities to impose costs high enough to force negotiation. Civil authorities tracked economic indicators that suggested collapse was approaching. regardless of battlefield outcomes. Both groups operated under constraints that allowed little flexibility. By 1945, discussions no longer centered on winning the war through superior tactics. They centered on how to influence an opponent whose capacity for replacement appeared unlimited. Every decision was made under the shadow of factories that could not be matched. The recognition was not announced publicly, but it shaped everything that followed. The decisive moment was no longer a single battle. It was the accumulation of evidence that production, not valor, was determining the war's outcome. By early 1945, the imbalance Japan had struggled to offset was no longer abstract. It was quantified, reported, and filed in plain language. American production figures circulated within Japan's war ministries, stripped of propaganda and optimism. They showed numbers that could not be countered by strategy. In 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 100,000 military aircraft. Japan produced a fraction of that total, and by 1945, its output was falling sharply. Shipbuilding told the same story. American yards launched thousands of vessels, cargo ships, tankers, landing craft, each one reinforcing a logistical system that fed itself. Japan's shipyards, short on steel and labor, struggled to replace even a single loss. The consequences reached the battlefield after the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Japan committed much of its remaining naval strength in a final effort to disrupt American landings in the Philippines. The battle cost the Imperial Navy 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and numerous destroyers. More damaging than the ships themselves was the loss of trained crews and experienced officers. There would be no recovery. Fuel shortages immobilized what remained. Battleships lay at anchor, unable to sortie. Training programs collapsed as aviation gasoline ran out. Pilots received minimal instruction before being assigned to operational units. In some cases, aircraft were delivered without enough fuel to conduct test flights. Meanwhile, American forces accelerated. New carrier task forces arrived already at full strength. Replacement pilots filled squadron rosters. Equipment losses were logged, compensated, and forgotten. The pace of operations increased rather than slowed. Inside Japan, this disparity forced a quiet recalibration. The concept of decisive naval battle, central to pre-war planning, was no longer viable. Without fuel, without trained air crews, without replacement hulls, such a battle could not even be assembled. The loss of the Philippines cut Japan off from Southeast Asian oil. Tanker routes collapsed under submarine attack. Refinery output fell further. By early 1945, the Navy rationed fuel so tightly that some units were assigned enough for a single sortie, with no expectation of return. Industrial reports confirmed what commanders already sensed. Even if factories were untouched by bombing, they lacked inputs. Even if weapons were produced, they could not be transported reliably. Even if troops were available, they could not be sustained. The war had crossed a threshold. Not a defeat that could be reversed by a counteroffensive, but a condition that no tactical success could repair. American planners understood this as well. Operations were scheduled with confidence that logistics would follow. Losses were anticipated and budgeted. The assumption was no longer whether the next objective could be taken, but how quickly. Japan's leadership now faced a reality it had postponed for years. The nation was no longer fighting an enemy army alone. It was fighting an industrial system that regenerated faster than it could be damaged. And as 1945 advanced, the weight of that system began to fall directly on the Japanese home islands. In March 1945, the Industrial War reached Japan's cities with full force. On the night of March 9-10, B-29 bombers attacked Tokyo with incendiaries, igniting fires that spread uncontrollably through densely built neighborhoods. Manufacturing districts burned alongside homes. Workshops that fed larger factories disappeared in hours. Power stations failed. Rail lines twisted under heat. The destruction was not symbolic. It targeted production capacity that Japan could no longer replace. Small subcontractors, critical to Japan's decentralized manufacturing system, were erased. Even where machinery survived, workers did not. Industrial output dropped further, not because plans changed, but because infrastructure ceased to exist. The raids continued. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities followed. Each attack removed capacity that had already been stretched thin. Each loss was permanent. There were no spare plants, no reserve labor pools, no stockpiles waiting to be tapped. Across the Pacific, American production responded in the opposite direction. Aircraft losses over Japan were replaced before units returned to base. New B-29 groups formed even as others flew daily missions. The bombing campaign intensified because the system supporting it expanded continuously. Japanese leaders received the reports in sequence. Industrial output charts dipped month by month. Transportation statistics collapsed. Food distribution faltered. Civilian morale strained under air raids that could not be prevented or meaningfully countered. Air defense units lacked fuel and ammunition. Interceptors were lost faster than they could be built. By mid-1945, the conclusion was unavoidable inside Japan's highest councils. The war was no longer determined by battlefield outcomes. It was determined by capacity, the ability to produce, supply, repair, and replace. And in that contest, Japan had no path to parity. This realization did not produce immediate surrender. It produced a final recalculation. If Japan could not match American industry, then the only remaining variable was cost. Plans focused on inflicting casualties during an invasion of the home islands, hoping that the scale of loss might alter American decision-making. But even this logic acknowledged the core truth: victory was no longer conceivable. Only influence over the terms of defeat remained. The Industrial War had been decided long before the last battles were fought. By 1945, Japan's acceptance was not public, but it was complete. The factories were silent, the ports were empty, the skies belonged to an enemy whose strength could not be exhausted. What followed was not a reversal, but an unraveling. In the months that followed the spring of 1945, the consequences of industrial collapse spread through every layer of Japan's war effort. Military units remained in the field, but their connection to the nation's economy had effectively been severed. Orders continued to flow, yet the means to carry them out diminished daily. Transportation was among the first systems to fail completely. Rail networks damaged by bombing operated sporadically, if at all. Coastal shipping, once the backbone of internal logistics, had been reduced to a handful of small vessels operating under constant threat. Fuel shortages immobilized vehicles and grounded aircraft. Movement became local, fragmented, and unreliable. Factories that survived air raids struggled to function. Power outages halted production lines. Raw materials could not be delivered in sufficient quantity. Skilled workers were either dead, displaced, or conscripted. Output figures reported to Tokyo bore little resemblance to operational needs. Even when weapons were produced, they often could not be distributed to units that needed them. For soldiers, the psychological impact was cumulative. The absence of resupply became routine. Wounded men understood that evacuation was uncertain. Units prepared to fight without expectation of reinforcement. Commanders adjusted plans not based on opportunity, but on depletion. Civilian life deteriorated alongside the military situation. Food shortages worsened as transportation collapsed, and agricultural production declined. Urban populations, displaced by bombing, flooded rural areas, ill-equipped to support them. Industrial workers, already exhausted, were asked to produce more with less under constant threat from the air. Within leadership circles, the industrial reality shaped every discussion. Assessments acknowledged that even if fighting continued, Japan's capacity to sustain organized resistance was eroding rapidly. The war had become a countdown measured in remaining fuel, remaining infrastructure, and remaining labor. Yet resistance persisted, not because leaders believed recovery was possible, but because no alternative path had yet been chosen. The machinery of war continued to turn, even as the industrial foundation beneath it crumbled. The acceptance of industrial defeat did not end the conflict. It reframed it. And as Japan moved deeper into the summer of 1945, the gap between intent and capability widened further. By the final weeks of the war, Japan's leaders no longer evaluated the conflict through conventional military metrics. Territorial control, unit strength, and operational plans had been overtaken by a more basic accounting: How much could still function? Ministries tracked remaining fuel reserves down to the barrel. Industrial planners estimated how many weeks electricity grids might hold. Military commands calculated how long organized resistance could be maintained without resupply. The strategic consequences were stark. Defensive plans for the home islands assumed minimal industrial support. Weapons were stockpiled in advance because continued production could not be relied upon. Training was curtailed to conserve fuel. Units were dispersed to reduce vulnerability, even though dispersal complicated coordination. Psychologically, the realization of industrial inferiority weighed heavily. Officers and officials understood that no battlefield success could alter the underlying equation. The United States could replace aircraft, ships, and trained personnel faster than Japan could destroy them. Time favored the enemy entirely. This understanding surfaced clearly in post-war testimonies and internal assessments. Japanese officials described the war's final phase as one in which outcomes were constrained not by courage or planning, but by production. The inability to sustain modern warfare against a fully mobilized industrial power became the central lesson drawn from the conflict. When the decision to surrender finally came in August 1945, it followed months of internal recognition that continuation offered no path to reversal. The industrial foundation required to wage modern war had been dismantled. The remaining options were limited, stark, and increasingly detached from achievable goals. After the war, Japanese military and civilian leaders examined the conflict with new clarity. Reports emphasized the decisive role of industrial capacity, logistics, and resource security. The conclusion was consistent. Japan had not lost because its soldiers fought poorly, but because the nation had engaged in a form of warfare its economy could not sustain. The acceptance that emerged in 1945 was not simply of defeat. It was of a fundamental truth about modern conflict. Wars were no longer decided solely by battlefield brilliance or individual sacrifice. They were decided by systems, by factories, supply chains, and the ability to endure loss without collapse. And with that understanding, the war passed into memory, leaving lessons that would shape planning long after the fighting ended. What Japan accepted in 1945 was not a single moment of defeat, but a transformation in how war itself was understood. The conflict had revealed that modern warfare no longer turned on isolated victories or heroic endurance alone. It turned on the ability to sustain effort across time, distance, and loss. Japan entered the war believing that speed, discipline, and decisive engagement could offset material disadvantage. By the end, it had learned that even the most determined resistance could not compensate for structural imbalance. Industry had become a weapon, one that operated continuously, silently, and at a scale beyond immediate perception. The United States did not simply defeat Japan's forces, it overwhelmed the framework that supported them. Factories replaced squadrons faster than they could be destroyed. Shipyards absorbed losses without pause. Logistics ensured that distance no longer weakened power. The battlefield extended into manufacturing districts, rail yards, and energy grids. This realization reshaped post-war military thought. Nations studied not just tactics, but supply chains. Not just weapons, but production rates. The emphasis shifted toward resilience, redundancy, and economic depth. War planning became inseparable from industrial planning. The human cost of this transformation was immense. Soldiers fought knowing that the outcome was being determined far from their positions. Civilians endured destruction aimed not at morale, but at capacity. The war's end carried with it an understanding that future conflicts would be decided long before the first shots were fired. In 1945, Japan accepted a reality that continues to define modern warfare, that in an age of total war, the ultimate battlefield is not only where armies meet, but where nations build, supply, and sustain the forces they send into the fight.